Well, welcome again to the first workshop for Reasons to Believe creation model, this one focusing on human origins and in partnership with peaceful science. We have many other guests from many other organizations here, and we are pleased to have all of you joining us. So thank you for your time, and we look forward to interacting with you throughout the afternoon. I'm going to introduce now Dr. Fazale Rana, biochemist and Vice President of Research and Apologetics at Reasons to Believe. Prior to joining RTB in 1999, Fuzz worked as a senior scientist in research and development at Procter & Gamble. He earned his BS in chemistry from West Virginia State College, now West Virginia University, and a PhD in chemistry with an emphasis in biochemistry from Ohio University. Fuzz conducted postdoctoral studies in the biophysics of cell membranes at the universities of Virginia and Georgia. He's author of Who Was Adam? And Humans 2.0, and several other books that I'm not going to list, but please welcome with me Dr. Rana.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I just want to say, on behalf, again, of everybody at Reasons to Believe, just how much we really appreciate everybody's involvement in the workshop today, where we're going to take a look at the question of human origins, and again, how can we continue to revise, update, and improve our human origins model. And I just want to say a special thank you to all the staff and volunteers at Reasons to Believe who've worked tirelessly behind the scenes for weeks and weeks to make sure that this event is successful. Thank you to the panelists who are here to engage our ideas. I really am humbled and honored that you would take the time to be here with us. I want to say a special thank you to AJ and to Josh, who really had the vision for this particular workshop and who really championed the idea and worked hard to take that vision and make it a reality. And again, I just want to say thank you too to our scholar community members who are allying with us in our mission at Reasons to Believe. So thank you so much. My task this afternoon is to present the RTB Human Origins model, and then to show how the model interacts with the scientific evidence. And I'm not going to be able to present the model in comprehensive form just because of the time constraints on the presentation. So there will be aspects of our model that I'm just simply not going to discuss in the presentation, but we can definitely engage them during the panel discussion and also during the workshop. When it comes to looking at how our model interacts with the scientific evidence, again, I can't be exhaustive. And what I've decided to do is actually in the presentation to give emphasis on how our model interacts with data coming from archaeology. Because as we've been talking about human origins, and I've noticed this as a trend in the broader science-faith conversation about human origins, there is a lot of emphasis on the molecular anthropology, on human population genetics, now on the genealogies, which I think is really important, of course, but we're neglecting other data sets, or we're de-emphasizing other data sets at times when we do that. So I think it is important to bring archaeological evidence to the conversation as well as evidence from the fossil record. I will also touch very, very briefly on how our model can be influenced by the genealogical Adam model. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here simply because I'm still in the process of thinking through what Josh has presented, not only today, but in terms of his book, The Genealogical Adam and Eve. And I just want to say that I think Josh has done something really very important because he's forced us, as a number of the panelists have said, to think about the question of ancestry maybe a little bit differently. And so he's done us a good service in the sense that we've got now another option that we can begin to look at in terms of how can this make our case for human origins much more robust. So we'll leave a lot of that conversation to the time of the panel, to the time of the workshop. And I just want to point out that I, again, very much appreciate the demeanor that Josh has brought to the table and his approach of again, looking to engage RTB in a way that helps us to become better. And I very much appreciate that posture. because the idea of, again, taking new information and looking at how that idea might influence our model is really part of the whole creation model approach. Since I've been involved with Reasons to Believe, even prior to joining the staff 20 years ago, the mindset has always been to take new information that comes from science, comes from theological insight, biblical studies, and continually to revise the creation model that we have here at Reasons to Believe. And with respect to the question of human origins, we've always have done that. So the very first edition of Who Was Adam was published in 2005. It's hard to believe that was 15 years ago because it just feels like yesterday. And in 10 years after its publication, we issued an updated and expanded edition of Who Was Adam, where we actually made significant revisions to our model based on discoveries that took place over the 10 years from the book's initial publication. And we've revised the model. And so doing a workshop like this is really not out of character for what we do at Reasons to Believe. And to me, my hope is that through this process, that again, what we can present is something that it helps to make the Christian worldview more credible, more winsome to people who are non-believers. And I really appreciate the fact that there's so many people here from so many different organizations and so many distinct perspectives. And many times when it comes to science-faith conversations, the conversations can become very territorial, where people have their own particular view and they stake out very hard ground, and they battle with one another for territory. And that just seems to me to be the wrong model. And my hope is that through workshops like this, that we can really begin to develop a very different approach, where even though we share distinct perspectives, that we can look at how do we collaborate with one another to make one another's approach more robust, more vigorous, more, again, so that we can, again, communicate, I think, to the world around us and to the church, that these science-faith conversations can be a gateway to people entertaining what the gospel has to say, not an excuse for people to walk away from the truth claims of Christ. Okay, with that editorial comment out of the way, let me go ahead and talk about our model. And for lack of a better term, I'm going to say that our approach at Reasons to Believe, it evokes a traditional biblical view of human origins. And thanks to Josh, who is pointing out that we need to be very precise in terms of what we mean with our terminology. The point that I'm making is that we do adopt an old earth creationist perspective on science faith issues, and that's no exception when it comes to the question of human origins. But we do derive our insight from biblical texts, from Orthodox Christian theology, and have, through that process, have adopted a model that has significant components that people would recognize as the traditional approach to human origins, that human beings were created through God's direct personal intervention as de novo creations, that there's a historical pair, a historical couple called Adam and Eve that really, really lived, and that they were the first human beings that gave rise to all humanity. That we would probably, at this point in time, adopt a genetic progenitor model. And that, of course, very important to our model is the idea that human beings are image bearers and that we are unique in that we bear God's image, that is a special status that only human beings hold. That when it comes to the image of God, and again, this is, again, something that we all think are coming to appreciate, how critical it is that we define precisely what we mean when we utilize terminology. And I will acknowledge that, again, there are three main perspectives on what the image of God is. I'm learning today that even within these perspectives, there can actually be some subtle but significant nuanced differences. But the three views, and I'm following after Jack Collins in my terminology, would be the resemblance view, the representative view, and the relational view. And we hold to a resemblance view here at Reasons to Believe, where we would argue that human beings have certain qualities or certain attributes that define the image of God. And those attributes are attributes that we would share, though to a limited extent, with some of the attributes that the Creator has. And that these attributes allow us to function as God's representatives here on earth, and also allow us to enter into a relationship with the Creator. So we wouldn't say that our view obviates the representative view or the relational view, but rather encompasses those two other perspectives. So in a sense, we are adopting somewhat of a composite view, where we think the resemblance view subsumes the representative and the relational view. Because, as a point that Jeff Schloss made, is that if we're going to serve as God's representatives here on earth, or we're going to enter into a relationship with God, there has to be some qualities that we possess that allow us to function uniquely as God's representatives, or allow us to enter into a relationship with our Creator. Now, when we talk about the resemblance view, at Reasons to Believe, we identify four components to the image of God: an intellectual component, a capacity for rational thought, for symbolic expression, that we have a capacity for technical inventiveness, for creativity, that we have a moral component, that we have an understanding of right and wrong, an inherent understanding of right and wrong. We have a sense of justice. We're spiritual beings in that we recognize a reality beyond the physical material universe, that we have a sense of transcendence, and that also we are relational creatures, not only in terms of our capacity to relate to the Creator, but our capacity to uniquely relate to other human beings through complex hierarchical social structures. Now, when it comes to our model, and I'm not going to talk much about this today, we are old earth creationists, which means that we are, for lack of a better way to describe it, skeptical about facets of the evolutionary paradigm. And so the question then becomes, well, what do you do with what so many people consider to be the overwhelming evidence for human evolution, like the hominin fossil record, or the shared biological features that we have as human beings with other creatures, including the great apes and the hominins? Well, our approach, and again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on my presentation with this, is to argue that the hominins were creatures that God created that existed for a period of time that went extinct. That these were creatures that had some intellectual capacity, emotional capacity, they had culture, they had technology, but that they were cognitively inferior to human beings, and that we would see these creatures as creatures that lacked the image of God, that would be the major distinction. And because they lacked the image of God, there's going to be cognitive differences and behavioral differences that separate or distinguish humans from the hominins. And we would argue that the hominins, again, were created by God. I would argue that minimum, that creation would consist of creating the major groups of hominins, like the Australopithecines, the Habilines, the Erectines, the archaic Homo sapiens. But within those groups, we would allow for the possibility that there could be, evolutionary events, speciation and things like that could create some limited diversity within those groups. Our approach is not ad hoc. If you look at the history of thought in biology, there were prominent scientists that would hold a view of the fossil record very similar to ours. One would be Louis Agassiz, the Swedish geologist, who argued that the history of life reflects a progressive series of creation events with biological groups originating from the mind of God. And so we would follow in Agassiz's footsteps. When it comes to the shared features that we see between humans and other creatures, we would argue that this is something that Scripture seems to anticipate, that Scripture anticipates a biological similarity between humans and other creatures. And in part, it's because when you look at the Genesis 2 account, it's, to me, provocative that Adam is made from the dust of the earth, but so too are the animals described in Genesis 2:19. They're made from the dust of the earth, which seems to imply to me that we would share physical attributes with the other creatures. Again, what distinguishes us would be the fact that we are image bearers. This is the key point of distinction. So we would see the shared features as reflecting common design elements as opposed to reflecting common descent. And again, this is not ad hoc. but is something that, again, is represented in the history of thought in biology. Sir Richard Owen, with his idea of the archetype, is I think, valuable to how we would think about, again, these shared features, where we would see these shared features as reflecting archetypical designs. Owen was critical in elaborating the concept of homology, and prior, again, to Darwin, he understood these as reflecting archetypical designs that originated in Owen's thinking from the mind of God. And those archetypes were then varied within the created order. Now, so our approach, again, to shared features is common design, not common descent. Now, here's a point, and I'd be interested in Josh's reaction to this. There are some elements, I think, of the genealogical Adam model that actually employ common design. So if one version of the genealogical Adam and Eve model would be that Adam and Eve were de novo creations in the garden, and that they were created to be biologically compatible with the humans outside the garden that evolved. And if that's the case, then this would be an example of common design, I think, where God is creating with common design. Just an interesting point of connection, and again, I'd be interested in seeing Josh's reaction to that point. Something that was, I think, is really very important, as Josh has driven home very well, I think, is the idea of defining what we mean by human. And that was one of my favorite chapters in the book that Josh wrote, is the chapter on the definition of human, or the chapters on the definition of human. And of course, scientifically, you could think of human as referring to hominins, so that would include the Australopithecines and related genera like Ardipithecus and Sahelanthropus, as well as the habilines and the erectines and archaic Homo sapiens. Or you could take human to refer to members of the Homo genus. So this is how scientifically the idea of human would be defined. But what we do at Reasons to Believe is take the notion that human essentially would refer to a Homo sapiens sapiens, to anatomically and behaviorally modern humans. That's what we mean by that, but that these humans, again, would be distinct from other creatures in that uniquely Homo sapiens sapiens, or anatomically and behaviorally modern humans, possess this quality, again, called the image of God. Now, it's interesting that when you look at thinkers, scholars who are working in the science faith arena, who are seeking to identify who Adam was, there's a number of options that I've seen people explore. One is to say that maybe Adam was an erectine. One of the species that would belong to the grouping that we could call the erectines. There are some who would want to incorporate Neanderthals and the Denisovans and maybe Homo heidelbergensis into Adam's identity. There are some who would argue it would be Homo sapiens, including the archaic Homo sapiens. Others argue that maybe the near anatomically modern humans should be included in this group. But again, at Reasons to Believe, we take the view that human refers to anatomically and behaviorally modern humans. And part of the thinking, on one hand, is rather simplistic. If we are all progenitors of Adam, and we're anatomically and behaviorally modern humans, and it's reasonable to think that maybe Adam was likewise anatomically and behaviorally modern. But there's another reason also, and that is because there is a minority of anthropologists that would argue that actually anatomically and behaviorally modern humans are different in kind from other hominins, that there's something that distinguishes us, that we're qualitatively distinct. And they would argue that what makes us qualitatively distinct, and this would be people like Ian Tattersall, Thomas Suddendorf as examples, they would argue that what makes us distinct would be our capacity for symbolism, what's called open-ended generative capacity, or ability to manipulate symbols in a near infinite number of ways to create alternative realities, alternative hypotheses, that we have a theory of mind and a capacity to form complex social hierarchical structures. And to me, I see these as intriguing in that these seem to be scientific descriptors of how you would understand the image of God from a resemblance approach. And so there's a lot of overlap between what seems to make us unique, at least according to some anthropologists, and again, the image of God qualities. Okay, so that's the RTB model kind of in a nutshell. Hopefully that gives you a sense for what we hold to. And now the question is, how do we interact with the scientific data? How do we make sense of the scientific data in light of our model? As I mentioned, I want to spend some time talking about the archaeological record. Because again, I think this is really very important data that factors into this conversation that we're having. And I take the position that we can actually use the archaeological record to probe when does the image of God appear and with who or with what bears the image of God. And the reasoning goes something like this, that if you adopt a resemblance view for the image of God, that means we're going to have certain capacities that are going to affect the way that we behave, which will affect the types of artifacts that we produce. And because of that, we can then go to the archaeological record and look for artifacts that are going to reflect, in effect, symbolism. We're going to look for artifacts that give a signature for symbolism, and hence the image of God. Now, this slide shows a cartoon of the archaeological record. This is an incredibly simplistic diagram, okay, but it helps to give us some sense for what the archaeological record looks like. Now, this was taken from the first edition of Who Was Adam, and at that time, the people viewed that Homo habilis as being the first hominin that employed, or at least regularly employed, the production of stone tools. Since that time, there has been some interesting discoveries suggesting that the Australopithecines actually employed stone tools as well. And I think those discoveries are compelling, but for the sake of our conversation, we're going to start with Homo habilis. And Homo habilis, which appears, 2.2 million years ago, employed a technology that's labeled the Oldowan technology, or the Mode 1 technology. And this consisted of taking a hammer stone and striking a core stone, producing flakes that were then utilized as the tool. So this is sometimes called expedient tool usage. And this technology appears, again, about 2.2 million years ago and persists until, 1.8, 1.7 million years ago, arguably. And there we see a new technology on the scene associated with the erectines, Homo ergaster and Homo erectus, called the Acheulean technology. And this is a picture showing some of the types of technologies produced by the erectines. And what the erectines were doing was not only producing flakes, but they were also shaping the core stone into a variety of shapes like pickaxes or hand axes and picks and things like that. They very well could have been making use of spears. They might have had opportunistic use of fire. So definitely a step change in sophistication compared to the habilines. This technology persists, again, in a fairly static mode for about 1 million years. And then we see the appearance of Neanderthals, 250,000 years ago. And with Neanderthals is the appearance of the Mousterian technology, which is clearly more sophisticated than that employed by the erectines. And then we see with modern humans what sometimes is labeled the sociocultural revolution, the human revolution, or the sociocultural Big Bang, where we see with anatomically and behaviorally modern humans a dramatically distinct and sophisticated toolkit associated with modern humans that seemingly demarcates humans, again, from the other hominins. Now, when we look at the archaeological record, I think it's fair for somebody to say, well, it does look like there's this gradual increase in sophistication and complexity to the behavior through the fossil record. And it looks like it's probably a really slow burn that then kind of takes off, perhaps with Neanderthals. So I think that's a fair way to view the archaeological record. But what's interesting to me is that the comparison is being made with a single point of comparison, namely modern humans and our behavior. What if we added another point of comparison, namely the behavior of chimpanzees? And in the last decade or so, there's been some incredible work observing chimpanzees, both in the wild and in captivity. And particularly in the wild, we have seen chimps do some rather remarkable things. There is a report of chimpanzees manufacturing spears, taking tree branches, and through a 6-step process, manufacturing spears that they actually will use to hunt. They'll hunt bush babies with these spears. Chimps produce these rather clever tools to extract termites from nests. They will fish. They'll develop tools to fish with. Chimpanzees actually will make stone tools. In fact, there's actually a discovery of a chimpanzee archaeological record, believe it or not, documenting stone tool use in a particular region of Africa for a particular group of chimps that goes back several thousand years. Chimps have been observed occupying cave sites in response to harsh conditions as a way to protect themselves. Chimps will fabricate beds out of tree branches where they will select certain tree branches that have the right type of tensile properties and that have insect repellent properties that they then will use to fabricate beds and will position them in trees in such a way that they can very quickly avoid predatory activity. Chimps mourn their dead. This is I think well understood. They make medicinal use of plants. There's an interesting report by Jill Pruitt's of being in the field one summer, and there was a wildfire that broke out, and she was describing the fact that she and her team struggled to figure out how to get away from the wildfire, and they observed a group of chimps actually being able to anticipate the change in direction of the wildfire, and that they were very close to the wildfire and exploiting it to feed. And in fact, she argued that if the chimps had opposable thumbs, she felt as if they could have maybe even harvested that fire opportunistically. So the whole point here is that I don't think anybody would conflate a chimpanzee with a modern human in terms of behavioral capacity, but these behaviors are clearly rather remarkable. And I would argue that these behaviors are qualitatively what we would infer from the archaeological record for the habilines and the erectines. In fact, this is not just simply my point. This is a point that I've seen in the scientific literature. For example, Julio Mercader and collaborators in an article in PNAS say, that's a horrible slide, by the way, it's impossible to read, but the full implications of this line of work require a reevaluation of the terms under which we can make meaningful comparisons of Oldowan and chimpanzee cultures. And I'll just go ahead and, the behavioral variables documented at Nuolo indicate that chimpanzees and hominins share cultural attributes, and we'll just stop there. So the point is that if we start thinking about the behavior, could we properly understand the chimps, the habilines, and the erectines to form a cluster that would then be distinct from that which we see for modern humans? Now, I haven't talked about Neanderthals yet, and I'm going to put Neanderthals on a pause for just a few moments. But the point is that I think you could make an argument that instead of seeing a gradual emergence of behavior, that we really see a genuine discontinuity in the archaeological record. Now, when it comes to humans, again, the argument would be that humans are fundamentally or qualitatively distinct from the other hominins. And part of the argument for this resides in a concept, again, called the sociocultural Big Bang. And this idea, I think, is beginning to kind of fall by the wayside, but I don't think that's actually a bad thing. I think it's actually a good thing, and I'll explain why that is in a minute. But for a number of years, archaeologists and anthropologists argued, again, that when modern humans appear on the scene, there's a point where there is a trigger event that seemingly leads to an appearance out of nowhere of dramatically distinct and sophisticated behavior. This is how Christopher Stringer describes the sociocultural Big Bang in the mid-1990s in this book, African Exodus. So this is a dated quote, but this is interesting. Before then, Homo sapiens were marking time culturally. For millennia upon millennia, they've been churning out the same form of stone utensils. About 40,000 years ago, a perceptible shift in the handiwork took place. Toolkits leapt in sophistication. Signs of the use of ropes, bone spear points, fish hooks, and harpoons emerge, along with the sudden manifestation of sculptures, paintings, and musical instruments. We also find evidence for the first long-distance exchange of stones and beads. It's an extraordinary catalog of achievements that seem to have come from nowhere. So again, this seems to indicate that there's something distinct about anatomically and behaviorally modern humans. Now, to me, nothing exemplifies this sociocultural Big Bang more so than the art that we see in the caves in Europe. And the art seems to show up out of nowhere when humans first make their way into Europe. This is what Anthony Sinclair said about, again, the sudden appearance of art in Europe. The study of early art has been plagued by our desire to see this essentially human skill in a progressive evolutionary context. Simple artistic expressions should lead to latter, more sophisticated creations. Yet for many outlets of artistic expression, cave paintings, textiles, ceramics, and musical instruments, the evidence increasingly refuses to fit. Instead of a gradual evolution of skills, the first modern humans in Europe were in fact astonishingly precocious artists. So this is the way people thought about, again, the idea of the human revolution. Now, of course, this poses some problems, at least for the RTB model, because we see, as we'll talk about in a minute, evidence for anatomically modern humans at about perhaps 150,000 years ago. But yet we don't see the sociocultural Big Bang till 40,000 years ago. So there's an intervening period of time where we have anatomically modern humans that are not behaviorally modern. Now, this is not a problem, of course, for an evolutionary perspective, but it is a problem for the RTB model. But that problem evaporates thanks to the recent discovery in a number of sites in Asia of art, of cave art, that dates actually, in some instances, older than the cave art in Europe and is identical in terms of its quality to the art that we see in Europe. And in fact, if you're paying attention to the news, you may have seen the headlines a few weeks ago about the discovery of the oldest story depicted on a cave wall in the island of Sulawesi, the southern part of the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia. And this is depicting a hunting scene. And what's interesting about this depiction, and this art dates at 44,000 years in age or older, is the appearance of what are called theranthropes. These are these human animal hybrids that are being depicted in the hunt. This is the first appearance of these types of depictions in cave art. This is the oldest appearance. In Europe, these human animal hybrids appear in cave art, but it's only about 10,000 years ago. And so this is indicating that these humans in Asia had a sense of an imaginary world, had a sense of maybe the supernatural. But even though these human-animal hybrids don't appear in the cave art, there is the discovery of the Lion Man statue, the Lowenmensch, that dates at about 40,000 years in age, again indicating that the humans in Europe also had that same type of sense of an imaginary world. And so this is, again, significant because it means that this capacity for art was already present in humanity before we began to migrate around the world, into Europe and into Asia. Chris Stringer says this: "It is a really important find. It enables us to get away from this Eurocentric view of a creative explosion that was special to Europe and did not develop in other parts of the world until much later. The basis for this art was there 60,000 years ago, and it may have even been there in Africa before 60,000 years ago, and it spread with modern humans." And in fact, we also have evidence for symbolism in caves in South Africa that dates somewhere between 50 to 80,000 years in age. And of particular interest is the report about a year ago of the oldest abstract drawing in the Blombus cave that dates at about 88,000 years in age. There's other evidence in the archaeological record that seems to point to the presence of symbolism somewhere between 100 to 130,000 years ago. And what I find to be interesting in this context is the work of Miyagawa, who argues that art very well may go as far back as about 125 to 130,000 years ago. And his argument is based on the discovery of rock art produced by the San that dates at 70,000 years in age. And this rock art actually shares attributes with the cave art in Europe. And the San diverged from the human branch as a people group somewhere between 100 and 150,000 years ago, which means prior to that point of divergence, the capacity for art probably was already there. So the point is that the archaeological record increasingly is pushing the date for behaviorally modern humans and the capacity for symbolism very close to the time where anatomically modern humans emerge. Now, when we're talking about symbolism, language is the ultimate expression of symbolic capacity. And unfortunately, you can't study the origin of language in the archaeological record. You can't really truly study it with biological markers either. This is a real difficulty. So you have to rely on essentially artistic expression as a signature for language as well, as a proxy for language. But it's intriguing to me that evolutionary biologists working to try to understand the evolutionary origin of language struggle to account for the evolution of language. For example, Chris Knight, in a review article, says that language evolved in no other species than humans, suggesting a deep-going obstacle to its evolution. One possibility is that language simply cannot evolve in a Darwinian world, that is, in a world based ultimately on competition and conflict. The underlying problem may be that the communicative use of language presupposes anomalously high levels of mutual cooperation and trust, levels beyond anything which current Darwinian theory can explain. And it's interesting to me because there is, again, a minority of anthropologists who are beginning to argue that when language appears, it appears suddenly, it seems to be unique to modern humans, and it coincides with the origin of modern humans. There's others that are arguing that language in its first inception is actually as syntactically complex as language is today. Miyagawa says the hierarchical complexity found in present-day language is likely to have been present in human language since its emergence. Tattersall and Chomsky and others have written recently, by this reckoning, the language faculty is an extremely recent acquisition in our lineage, and it was acquired not in the context of slow, gradual modification of pre-existing systems under natural selection, but in a single rapid emergent event that built upon those prior systems, but was not predicted by them. The relatively sudden origin of language poses difficulties that may be called Darwin's problem. Noam Chomsky believes that the capacity for symbolism was instantiated all at once in its totality in modern humans. And when you start talking about that type of mechanism or mode and tempo for the origin of humanity, that to me looks like a creation event, or arguably like a creation event. Okay, so then what about Neanderthals? All right, what about Neanderthals? Did Neanderthals have the capacity for symbolism? Were the Neanderthals like us, or did they approximate behavior like our behavior? And to be clear, there are all kinds of claims in the scientific literature towards that end. Claims that Neanderthals made art, made jewelry, made music, possessed language, they buried their dead, they mastered fire. These are claims that clearly are there in the scientific literature. But in my experience, while many times these claims gain enormous amount of public exposure and press, it's the other studies that essentially challenge these claims that many times go largely unnoticed. For every one of these claims, there are other studies that undermine those claims, that suggest that Neanderthals lack those properties, or those capacities, I should say. Tattersall and Schwartz, this is a somewhat of a dated quote, but it still applies. Among Neanderthals, all claimed instances of early symbolism are disputed. And I don't have time to step through each one of those claims and show why those claims don't, in my opinion, don't withstand scientific scrutiny, but we can just use one fun example just to illustrate the point. And this would be the example of the Neanderthal Neanderthal music. This is a bare femur, a cave bear femur, with holes punched in it that people have interpreted as a Neanderthal flute. And these types of quote-unquote flutes are discovered in a number of archaeological sites. Most of them are actually attributed to modern humans. There's one or two sites where these are found that are Neanderthal sites, where they're again attributed to Neanderthal musical production. The problem is that when you study the microscopic features of this flute, you see that the interpretation is that the puncture marks were not made by Neanderthals, but instead were made by spotted hyenas that were scavenging the cave bear remains. And so the point is that this is not bona fide evidence for Neanderthal symbolic capability or the fact that Neanderthals could make music. And compare that flute to this flute made out of ivory that's the oldest musical instrument discovered. This is 37,000 years in age approximately, and it's made out of ivory, which is the best material these humans would have had access to. Ivory is solid. This had to be very carefully carved and constructed and fitted together in order to form this musical instrument. This is a far cry from the claims of the Neanderthal bone flute. Tattersall and Schwartz argue that Neanderthals lacked the capacity for symbolism, that symbolism is uniquely a modern human capacity, and like Chris Knight, they argue that to go from a non-symbolic state to a symbolic state is a huge chasm. Symbolic and non-symbolic cognitive states, they argue, are clearly separated by a qualitative gulf. The former is not simply an extension of the latter, a little bit more of the same. Now, to me, the clincher for why I don't think Neanderthals were like us in any sense of the word is the trajectory that Neanderthal technology took. Neanderthals were on Earth longer than we've been on Earth, and their technology was largely static throughout the duration of their time on Earth. Modern humans appear on the scene, and our technology was archaic initially, but then the tempo and significantly the tempo of change only began picking up after the point at which symbolic objects appeared. Evidently, a new potential for symbolic thought was born with our anatomically distinct species, but was only expressed after a necessary cultural stimulus had exerted itself. The stimulus was most plausibly the appearance of language. Then within a remarkably short space of time, art was invented, cities were born, and people had reached the moon. In other words, how do you explain the very different trajectories that Neanderthal technology took and modern human technology took? There's got to be something fundamentally distinct about modern humans. And again, it appears to be symbolism, which I would argue is a marker for the image of God. Okay, let's go to the fossil record, and there's a lot we could do with the fossil record. I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to emphasize, as we look at the fossil record, specifically, the origin of anatomically modern humans. But before I do that, the first point that I want to make is that humans and Neanderthals are clearly, when you look at the skeletal remains, morphologically distinct. But to me, what is most important as we look at the distinctives morphologically between Neanderthals and humans would essentially be the structure of the Neanderthal brain. Neanderthals had a more elongated skull than modern humans. Modern humans have a globular skull. And this elongated skull is actually rather significant because it influences the shape of the brain in a significant way. Here's a study that was published in 2003 that essentially looks at reconstructing the brain shape of, I think there was a Homo erectus specimen or specimens in this, archaic Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and modern humans. And what they noted in this study is that the Neanderthal brain is qualitatively similar to that of Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis. It's just simply larger. But even though the Neanderthal brain is larger than the human brain slightly, the human brain is fundamentally distinct. And it's distinct in that it has an expanded parietal lobe. And the parietal lobe is the part of the brain that plays a role in our sense of self. It plays a role in the processes required for language and for math. And it's part of the brain that goes quiescent during religious experiences. And so this is, again, signifying something is distinct about modern humans. Now, the question is, when does the modern human brain appear? Does it appear with near anatomically modern humans? Or when does it appear? Well, this is I don't have, unfortunately, the reference to this. This is taken from a study done where the researchers were looking at the cranial facial features of Homo erectus, Neanderthals. The number one grouping is for the near anatomically modern humans. Number two corresponds to modern humans that date between 100 and about 135,000 years ago. And then number three corresponds to modern humans in the fossil record around 30,000 years in age. And what you can see is that it's about 130,000 years ago where you begin to see the distinct globular skull features for modern humans appearing. Here's another depiction of that data with two different principal components. So the point is, it looks as if you could argue that the globular skull and the expanded parietal lobe appears about 130,000 years ago. And again, I think this is significant because it could account for our capacity for symbolism. And so we're seeing, again, a kind of a convergence of evidence where the globular skull of modern humans is about 130,000 years ago. This is where we're starting to see the first evidence for symbolism. It's a coherent picture that's beginning to emerge from the archaeological and fossil record that I think helps us define the point in time where human beings appear, where, again, theologically, human beings appear. Okay, let's take a quick look now at molecular anthropology. And I'm just going to simply comment on the results in general terms that come from molecular anthropology. And we document a number of studies in Who Was Adam, taking a look at a number of different genetic markers that people have pursued over the years, trying to characterize the origin of humanity through molecular anthropology. And I think it's safe to say that collectively these studies seem to indicate that humanity had a single origin event in a single location relatively recently from a relatively small population. And one of the collection of studies that I find to be really intriguing are studies that have been done with human parasites. There's been a number of studies done looking at the genetic variability of human parasites throughout the world and reconstructing essentially their history through through anthropology, through these molecular techniques. And you could think of these genomes as being proxies for the human genome because of the close association of the parasites with modern humans. And again, these studies give you, again, a similar type of set of results as the studies looking at the genetic markers from the human genome. Now, the question I think that has come up, maybe not today so much, but in other conversations, is why focus on mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomal DNA? Because these are the genetic markers that everybody is talking about in the concept of mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam. And to me, I think there are some good reasons to give some preference to these genetic markers. And one is because they don't undergo recombination. Secondly, they give a very clean inheritance pattern. And thirdly, we don't see any evidence for introgression with other hominins in these genetic markers. So I think that they give us a picture for genetically when, again, modern humans would appear. It gives us a cleaner read on that question. Now, the results that come from studies in molecular anthropology provide, of course, very powerful and strong evidence for the out-of-Africa model for human origins, which is a model that says that humanity originates recently in a single location in Africa, and that it's through migration that humanity occupies the world. And I'm old enough now that I can remember when this was a really radical insight that was coming from the early days of molecular anthropology, because this idea supplanted multi-regionalism. You know, the idea that humanity evolves over the span of 2 million years, where humans independently in multiple parts of the world undergo an evolution from a primitive form to a modern form, and that humanity's origin is from a globally diffuse large population. And this idea now is largely, I think, cast to the wayside, and again is replaced with this out of Africa model. And why I think this is significant is that this model actually does share resonance with a traditional biblical model for human origins, in this sense that both approaches view humanity's origin as recent, in a single location, arguably from a small population. So there's resonance, there's harmony between this out of Africa idea and I think a biblical model of human origins that relies on elements of a traditional biblical understanding of humanity's beginnings. Now, what do we do with the concept of mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam? Of course, you know, from an evolutionary perspective, the argument is that there were many Eves, that there were many Adams that were alive at that time, and that the mitochondrial Eve is that one lucky mother whose genetic material, or at least whose haplotype persists today in modern humans uniquely, or at least is descended from that particular haplotype. And in Who Was Adam, both the original edition as well as the expanded and updated edition in other places, at Reasons to Believe, we have pushed the idea that maybe mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam could actually be the biblical Adam and the biblical Eve. And I'm at the point now where I'm actually willing to take several steps back from that claim. I find the concept, again, intriguing, that you could have these two potentially individuals that, you know, that gave rise to the mitochondrial DNA in every human and the Y chromosomal DNA in every person, but we're backing away from the idea that these are pointers to the biblical Adam and the biblical Eve. So this is a place where I think our model really is in need of revision, and we're willing to do that. But again, I don't feel too troubled by that, because I think, again, in a general sense, the results from molecular anthropology are broadly supportive of a traditional biblical reading of human origins. Now, does that mean that that the scientific data rules out a genetic Adam and Eve? And I think the answer to that question is no. I don't think the scientific data rules this out. And I don't think so for a couple of reasons. One, this was a point that Josh was making, and I think I'm going to be making this point maybe in a little bit different way than Josh was making it. But first of all, when you realize that the work in molecular anthropology is being done within the context of the evolutionary framework, then by definition, you have to have a population. Populations evolve, individuals don't evolve. So by definition, you are forced to have many Eves and many Adams, simply by definition. But of course, the real reason why everybody thinks that there was an initial population, not a primordial pair, from the genetics data has to do with these two equations that you'll see in an introduction to population genetics texts. And these equations relate genetic variability to mutation rate and effective population size. So if you know the mutation rate, the effective or the heterogeneity, you can calculate effective population size. And this type of modeling based on these concepts indicates that humanity comes from, again, several thousand individuals, not a primordial pair. But I'm of the opinion that the numbers that are generated through these studies are probably overinterpreted. In this sense, many times when I'm reading the literature in molecular anthropology, it's almost as if people are treating these numbers like they're constants of physics, as opposed to what they actually are, which are estimates about what the population size would look like. And just to illustrate that, there's a couple of studies done by the same research group looking at the same genetic marker, and the only difference is the number of population groups that they were studying in these studies. And you see that the same group using the same methodology winds up with two different results that, again, are giving you the same coherent picture of a relatively small population size, but this is just giving you a sense for, again, how much uncertainty resides in these results. Another concern that I have is that, are these methods actually valid? In science, when you carry out a method, you need to validate the method. You need to show that that method works as intended. And the way you do that, at least in part, is to apply the method to systems that you know what the answer is. And if you apply the method to systems where you know what the answer is and you get the right answer, you feel comfortable that the method works. And so the question is, have these population size methods been actually validated? And I don't think the answer is yes. I don't see any work where the methods are validated, and it would be very hard to imagine how you could go about doing that validation with humans. But there is work that takes place in conservation biology where people are very interested in population size and genetic variability, where studying endangered species, we actually have initial population sizes at a particular point in time. And in a number of studies, I'm not going to get into them, I'm beginning to run out of time here. In a number of studies, you see that these models do not predict the results that you would expect. That when we know initial population size, based on the modeling, we expect a particular a degree of genetic variability, and what we actually see is genetic variability that's much more extensive than the models predict, which means that if you started with that genetic variability and worked your way backward, you would overestimate the initial population size. And these are just a number of studies that I've collected where you see this particular problem. There are people that are working in this area that even question now if mitochondrial DNA actually is predictive of population size. This is a statement made by Hans Elgren in the Journal of Biology, where he essentially raises this very point. And so to me, when I've brought this point up, I've been soundly criticized by people for bringing up this point. But to me, I think it's worth bringing up, and I'm a little reticent to back away from this simply because if in a number of studies in conservation biology we're seeing the failure of these models, or seeing that these models are not as predictive as we would like them to be, that suggests to me that when we're applying these same kind of principles to characterizing the human population size, maybe we ought to be a little bit circumspect about the conclusions that we're drawing. And in fact, it was interesting, in 2008, Quentin Atkinson actually published a paper citing the very studies that I have cited in my work, where he was raising the question whether or not mitochondrial DNA is in fact a reliable predictor of population size. So there is actually people working in this area who have shared this concern that I've raised. Okay, so to be a little bit more positive, and again I'm going to wind up here just in a second, there is work that I think helps us to go simply beyond just simply criticizing the work in population genetics, and actually make the case that maybe it is possible that you could start with two individuals and account for the genetic variability that we see today. Ann Gager, who's here, was involved in a project where the work was the results were published recently, that at least is suggestive that this we could very well possibly model again, results in such a way that we could account for the genetic variability today, again, starting with two individuals. Now, in this modeling, the TMRA was 4. But in a recent blog article, A.J. Roberts has suggested that if you employ a concept that she calls mosaic Eve, where each of Eve's eggs was genetically distinct, you could actually wind up with a TMRA of 27, which now means that you could quite possibly account for the genetic diversity in people, in populations today, from starting with a primordial pair and the mosaic Eve concept. So anyway, I'm going to wrap up just by simply making the point that I think when we look at specifically the point where modern humans appear, we see what I think to be a confluence of evidence, where we see the mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam appearing approximately 100 to 150,000 years ago. We see the origin of symbolism at that time and the origin of distinctly anatomically modern skulls with globular skull shapes at about the same time. And I think that in light of our model, that this data actually comports rather well. It comports rather well. And I think the point in our model where we have perhaps the most work to do, again, is really with this question of, can you show that there was a primordial pair that was a genetic progenitor to all humanity? That's a place where we still have work to do, and why it's worth, I think, having conversations with Josh about the genealogical Adam.